Hello and welcome to another deep dive edition of Football Today. I am your host, Josh Schneiderweiler, and I am joined today by football broadcaster David Goss. David, are you excited to talk about the Jose Mourinho to Roma move?
Yeah, it's all I've been thinking about for the last 3 days. I'll say this, I'm very excited about this. Mourinho has one of those names where wherever he goes, the local people say it with their accent. So I'm excited for all of the Mourinhos that are coming out over the next year or two.
Well, obviously, as you know, Dave, I was really just joking there. We are not talking about Jose Mourinho, or at least I hope not, on this podcast.
He's going to come up.
He will come up, but we are going to be talking about maybe the next Mourinho, if you will. One of the hottest prospects in coaching. He's not even a prospect at this point. Julian Nagelsmann went recently, about a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, from RB Leipzig to Bayern Munich. And that's what we're kind of talking about in this episode, is what makes that move so special. And what makes that move so special is that not that he went from Leipzig to Bayern, but that he went for 25 million euros, or what has been reported as 25 million euros, which breaks the bank and the transfer record for a manager. The previous high was Andre Villas-Boas for 15 million euros from Porto to Chelsea. And what's also interesting about this is that he's not the only manager to make a move recently in Germany with a transfer fee kind of associated with it. Haasenhuttel went from Frankfurt to Borussia Mönchengladbach as well for 7.5 million euros. And Marco Rose went from Mönchengladbach to Dortmund for 5 million euros as well. So a lot of managers changing teams, and a lot of money, 37.5 million euros total, getting thrown around too as well in those fees. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Josh. You brought this topic up when Nagelsmann moved of, is there value in spending money to transfer for a manager? And then you put a question in here, which I hadn't really thought about, which is, what other field in the world do you only interview people who currently are unemployed to fill your role? Because if you look at managers, it's who's available, whose contract's ending, or who's already been let go. And that's the field that you pull from why wouldn't you want to look at successful managers at other teams and see how they could fit in with you? And so it's really interesting. It's interesting that Nagelsmann set this record. It's also interesting. It's the second time Nagelsmann's been on this list of the top 15 manager transfers of all time, because when he went from Hoffenheim to Leipzig, it was a 5 million euro fee as well. And so it looks like this is a change in the way the world operates, Josh. And I don't know about you, but for me, it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a ton of sense. We'll, dive into that analogy maybe a little bit later. But I do think it's also really interesting that this is happening in Germany. And, I think a lot of new trends kind of start in Germany. And this seems like it definitely could be one of them. You talk about managers not moving teams, except if they're, out of contract or been fired. I spoke with, my previous co-host, John McKenzie, used to do this show, just to, bounce some ideas off of him. And he couldn't even think of the last time that it had happened. And, we'll run down the list right now of some of the other notable times in history when this has happened. But, if John couldn't think of any off the top of his head, it shows like just how uncommon it really is, or has been in the past. And most of all of these previous times were quite recent, in addition to the three that we already mentioned. Dave, do you want to kind of talk about some of the other ones?
Yeah, so you mentioned Villas-Boas, which was the record, 15 million from Porto to Chelsea when he came to England. This one I didn't even know. Brendan Rodgers from Celtic to Leicester was somewhere around the 10 million euro range. That partially included paying for his assistants and staff to come over. So the money was sort of split up to a level. You could say that that's been wildly successful for Leicester City, and it's money well spent, and they would spend it again. Ruben Amorim, who went from Braga to Sporting Lisbon and has them on the verge of a historic title this season, and is one of the up-and-coming coaches. And this is one of the things we'll get into, but it feels like they're going to make that money back if they want to, purely off allowing him to go somewhere else, as highly touted as he's become.
And also like the Champions League, that Champions League money that, I mean, just getting into the Champions League, and we'll get into that as like a possible benefit of the reason why a team would do this. But like they're going to be making that money up in the instant they get into the Champions League, which I think they've already like essentially guaranteed. So like they've already made that money up.
And for a lot of these clubs, player sales. And you don't sell players if you're not successful and if they're not successful. And the manager ties into all of this. And last one I got to mention is Mourinho's on this list multiple times.
Yeah.
So I said he would get mentioned. But one of the things to think about is, so Mourinho's on this list the first time when he went from Inter to Real Madrid. But the other time is when he went from Porto to Chelsea, at about 6 million euros. If you think about that, that was in about 2005. And you think about the way the transfer market has built and changed, Nagelsmann for 25 million euros is a steal compared to what you were paying Mourinho back then. And for Chelsea, it was worth every penny because of the way the club was built and the value the club gained with Mourinho at the head of it. And so I think that's the best example of long-term how this has worked for a club. And it's probably a lot of what Bayern is looking to follow in this move.
Yeah, and Brendan Rodgers is on this twice again. So he from Swansea to Liverpool, which was a huge success for Liverpool. I mean, up until that point, lots of struggles for Liverpool under, Kenny Dalglish and Roy Hodgson. And he kind of took them back into Europe, made that, incredible run for the title. So he's on that list and worked out a lot. As you go down this list, like a lot of these guys have been successful. It hasn't all been successful. I mean, you get a Mark Hughes from Blackburn to Manchester City in there for 6 million euros, not really successful there. Southampton to Everton, Ronald Koeman from Southampton to Everton for 6 million euros. So it's not like it all works out, but I think the hit rate is better than you'd expect. And also, I am wondering if maybe this actually took a hit after Villas-Boas was such a failure at Chelsea that maybe it kind of scared teams off from this, because that was a spectacular failure. It really was.
Absolutely. So just for context for people, we have this list as the top 14 transfers of managers. Maurizio Sarri's at 14 at about 5.5 million euros. And then Villas-Boas is at 15 million at 2, but Brendan Rodgers from Celtic was about 10 million at 3. So it's a pretty small range, most of these moves. And then you've got Villas-Boas at 15 and Julian Nagelsmann now at 25, which in theory are really changing this and breaking the bank. But most of what we're talking about is a pretty small range. And for most of these clubs, it's not chump change, but it's what they spend on non-starter players a lot of times, right? So even though this is money that's being spent and it matters and it changes the way clubs can operate, it really isn't that big. And then I want to put it in this context, which is this is the salaries of some of the top managers over the last year. So you're talking about, okay, sometimes maybe you're paying between 4 and 5 million euros just to get the managers into the building. Pep Guardiola, the reports are that he's on his newest contracts making about 20 million pounds a year. Jurgen Klopp at about 15 million pounds. Mourinho closing out at Tottenham was about 15 million pounds as well. Now it sounds like Tottenham's going to pay a good chunk of him to coach Roma because he keeps coming up in this show. I told you, Josh. Carlo Ancelotti, about 11 million pounds at Everton. And then Marcelo Bielsa is at 8 million pounds at Leeds, which is fifth on this list. And then is the highest proportion to what the team spends on their footballing side, plus what the manager makes. And then one other interesting one that I thought out there was Sean Dyche, who makes about 3.6 million pounds a year, which is higher than any player on his roster. And I don't think anyone would argue with that, right? Sean Dyche and Marcelo Bielsa are worth every penny of what they're being paid, and they're worth that value to their club. And I think that's what's changing now, Josh, is the understanding of the value of managers and what they can do for your team.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, and then those guys are making a lot of money, and I don't, and we'll come to it later, a little game of how much you think these managers are worth in the transfer market. But I mean, I think Pep Guardiola should be the highest paid player or person at City because he's the most important.
Right.
And ditto for, you'd probably say Jurgen Klopp as well. I did want to ask you, though, what do you make of a lot of this happening in Germany? Do you think there's a particular reason or, is it just kind of coincidence? What do you think?
I think that there's a value on leadership and management in Germany, just as a country, as a people, as a culture. And I think there's an example of a level of success of that style matters. If you read Jurgen Klopp's book and you talk about tactics and the way he came up, and obviously Ralf Rangnick as well, there was an assumption for a really long time in Germany that the team with the better roster would just win. That's the way the game should be played. And it was a surprise if they didn't. And then the idea of using tactics to change the flow of the game and creating opportunities for your team and winning was something new. And we're talking like early 2000s. We're not talking about 1971. And so the idea that you could have a manager who could get you points that maybe you're not straight paying for because of the quality on the roster is a newer concept. And now you're looking at a country where you've got a lot of coaches who are coaching experts. They're not former players who became coaches. And so you've got this level of expertise and this ability to punch above your weight and to bring value to your club. And I think we see Dortmund on the list of the clubs that's spent money for managers multiple times. And think about when they're successful, the amount of money they make on selling players off and how much it's worth for them. And so I think for Germany, there's all of that acknowledgement. And then there's the acknowledgement that the league doesn't make as much as some of the other leagues in Europe. And so to be able to continue to contend, they need to be efficient in every field that they operate in, on the field, off the field. And quality managers is a place that they've been able to, I think, take a step forward and lead for a little while here and be able to contend with clubs that are at times bigger than them in Champions League and in Europa League. And I think there's importance there in Germany, and it's been successful. So why would you not continue to follow a model for now that's shown its success over the last 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think a lot of that rings true. I definitely agree. And you mentioned a name that I also just kind of wanted to go on maybe a little tiny tangent with, and that is Ralf Rangnick. And it's interesting, all the people we mentioned and all the people who have just moved around in the last month there. I said Marco Rosa, Adi Hütter, Jesse Marsch, who's now going to RB Leipzig, and Julian Nagelsmann, who's going to Bayern. They're all former Red Bull managers and, Ralf Rangnick disciples, if you will. John mentioned to me when we were talking that, could the league become too homogenous because they're all going to be playing the same football? What do you make of the fact that there are 4 ex-RB managers at the top of German football? Like, is that going to be the new in vogue thing for teams around Europe, just like signing RB managers? And 2, are you worried as a fan of German football that the league's going to become too homogenous?
So I think for the first one, and we did an episode about the Red Bull model and what it is, and I mentioned I've spent some time around it, especially in New York. And the way it was explained to me is Ralf Rangnick valued developing people the way he saw developing players, right? So he built that club on, well, we only sign 21-year-olds and younger, and we build them up. And it's been explained to me that's how he felt about people everywhere. That's why Jesse Marsch left a head coaching job to go be an assistant at Leipzig under Ralf Rangnick for a year, because he knew that Ralf Rangnick would look out for him and take care of him if he valued him and trusted him. And it ended up in the Salzburg job and now the Leipzig head coaching job. So that's been part of Ralf Rangnick's DNA the whole time. And I think that is unique. And I think the Red Bull model allowed it to be unique because you have money where you can support people to get coaching licenses and learn about the game on different continents and still operate within your system, which is unique and gives that opportunity to really learn the game. That takes me to the second point, which is I do not worry about that because the number one attribute of these managers is that they're intelligent. It's not that they play a certain style in a certain way. It's that they're smart managers that care about the game, that have studied the game, that understand how to watch it and react and get their teams to understand what they're doing. I don't believe the success of all these managers is because they know how to press. or they know how to play a certain style. I think the success of a lot of these managers is that they're intelligent, well-educated, and well-spoken managers that can run groups and lead. And so I think you're going to see a lot of these managers, if everyone's pressing in the Premier or in the Bundesliga, they're going to start to shift and change what they do and change how they do it. And I think you've already seen that with Nagelsmann over the teams he's led, from Hoffenheim to Leipzig to probably now with Bayern, where you're the favorites of how his team's going to play and how they're going to operate. And so I don't worry about that, because I think when you come out of good coaching and good backgrounds, then you're ready to take on that next challenge. And it's not just, hey, come in here and run this system, because it's not even possible, right? Like, you can't play the exact same way for Marco Rosa, he couldn't play the same way at Gladbach that he did at Salzburg, because Salzburg are the, Barca's or Man City of their league. And it's a different challenge than what you're doing. So I don't worry about that, because I think the key to all these managers' success is their ability to read, understand, go back on the history they've learned, go back on the different moments they've learned, and adapt as their team plays.
And just while we're on this little train of thought, it is interesting looking at Nagelsmann at Leipzig, because as we mentioned before, he came in for 5 million euros and then left for 25 million euros. And I'm not saying that you can easily replicate that in the future, but Jesse Marsch, when he was at Salzburg, he did not have a release clause in that contract, at least as it was reported by Transfer Market. Now, nothing was ever reported about what compensation. Let's be honest, it's two Red Bull clubs, but what compensation was given to Salzburg for that. But, there's a good chance that Jesse Marsch does the exact same thing and leaves Leipzig in, 2 or 3 years or what have you, and goes for 10 million euros or, something like that on this list, just like, Brendan Rodgers. And I could see that. And so Leipzig might be the first team to really show that it could be profitable to sell on managers, which is, as far as I'm concerned, something that's never really happened in the history of football. A team proving that they can do that, not just with one person, but with multiple coaches. So that would be kind of just incredible, in my opinion. But, I do think now is a kind of a good time to look at kind of the pros and the cons, because it's not a slam dunk, and there's a reason why it doesn't happen often. So Dave, can you kind of weigh kind of the positive and negatives, from the eye of a club or, a sporting director who is interested in doing this?
Yeah, Josh. So I think let's start with, how much is a manager worth and what the value is. And so you found a research paper out there from 2016 looking at Bundesliga data, and said that the top 20% of managers were worth 0.3 points per game more than the bottom 20% of managers, depending on how long the season is. That's around 10 to 12 points a season, which is massive. And as we've talked about, not just the value on selling on managers, it could mean the difference between Champions League, selling players at a high level or not. Omar Chowdhury of the 21st Group talked about this and said, we know the best managerial hires have been worth in the region of 10 points a season to a team. For players, you're usually looking at a top end of 5 or 6 points. And then talked about big improvements that managers have caused, like Antonio Conte, first to Juventus and then to Chelsea. You have a slightly below average manager now. Maybe you'll get one slightly above average. In that case, it seems fair to say that the manager replacements might be worth, at a guess, more like 3 to 5 points a season if you do them right. So you talk about what a player can be worth and the numbers that teams spend on players, and then what a manager can be worth is a massive part of why this is, I think, starting to become popular. And another quote from Omar Chowdhury that you put in here, players are a bit like listed stocks and shares. There is a lot of information about them in the market, so they tend to be efficiently priced. Compared to managers, they are more expensive because you're paying a premium on certainty. Managers are more akin to startups. The return can be bigger, but there's more uncertainty about who can deliver that, so they're cheaper. And I think that goes to the uncertainty and the fears around this, and also the lack of experience of it happening in the past. Is there's a real unknown of exactly what that manager brings to that team and how it'll fit into your team. And you talk about stats, and it's not just deep level analytics, but a player plays on the field, he scores a goal, they win. You know exactly what that player brought to the game and what he can bring to your team. And I still think there's a level of unknown of how that manager will fit in my side. and how a manager at a lower end of the table can scale up to a top end of the table. And I think this kind of goes around maybe why Sean Dyche has or hasn't gotten the opportunities that some people think he would. And then you look at other managers and say, well, can they fit in my country? Can they fit into this style? There's a lot of unknowns behind a lot of what we believe can be positives.
Yeah, but as Chowdhury says, there's a lot more uncertainty, but there's a lot, bigger return that you can get from it. You mentioned in the kind of earlier quote, because this whole thing from Chowdhury, by the way, was written I think back in 2017. So it's, his ideas on it are, quite old. But Conte this year wins the league for Inter, right? Breaks Juventus's title run. Obviously, huge ramifications and consequences in a good way. Julian Lopetegui at Sevilla. We mentioned they're in the title race right now, which is crazy. We mentioned Ruben Amorim in Portugal. You could even throw Niko Kovac at Monaco right now. Managers aren't everything. Those clubs also made good decisions in transfer market and recruitment and, stuff off the pitch as well, with backroom deals and stuff, in the case of Monaco and others. So it's, we don't want to, or at least I don't want to put all the praise on these managers. But at the same time, I think their effects are undeniable to some degree. And when you find the right manager, there's a reason they, can stay in a job for 7 years. And, if in the case of Sean Dyche, or their effect around a club can be way more all encompassing than even a really good player. Likewise, in a bad way, they can have the same effect. I mean, if we're looking at Tottenham right now, right? They're probably the perfect example of the good and bad of this, right? You can make the right hire and you can launch your club from, a good club to a Champions League finalist club. And likewise, you can have a bad manager and tank the club. Did Harry Kane change in the last 5 years? No, Harry Kane hasn't. Sure, there's been some other player, trading or lack thereof, but it's a lot of that's down to the manager. And so you see the good and the bad. And so it's a risky reward, but for some of the sums we're talking about, 5 million euros or 6 million euros, 7, 8, 9, 10, it seems like it's an inefficiency.
And one of the things that I found interesting in thinking about this was your ability to amortize that fee over the years, because, as you said, they could be there for a while, because there is no hard end time on a manager's ability, right? With a player, if you buy a player at 25, you know that it's going to stop at some point. They're no longer going to be able to do the things they do well. And so you can really only break that transfer fee out to as many years as they're a part of your team, unless you sell them on. For Julian Nagelsmann here, at his age, he could be around Bayern for 25 years if he chooses to and it works. And then the fee looks silly because your ability to say, well, it's only 1 million euros a year added to his salary. Brendan Rodgers at Leicester City as well. And obviously Sir Alex Ferguson's the big comparison that you're going to make with coaches like that. But it just struck me in thinking about this because I started to put it in the context of players. And by the way, 25 million euros for players, a borderline starter at times for Bayern Munich. Benjamin Pavard came in for 30 million euros in the last transfer window. They sold Thiago Alcantara for about 22 million. So that's kind of the range we're talking about. And this could be a guy who could be around for 10 years, or as you said, could be around for a few years, and then you sell him on for a similar number to what you got him from, to a Real Madrid, to a PSG, whatever it is, and you end up breaking even or even making money. And so with managers, not just does it affect everything, and you had a great quote in here as well in our notes, which was 2 million Tottenham paid Southampton to buy Mauricio Pochettino out of his Southampton contract in 2014 will go down as the best £2 million Daniel Levy has ever spent. That money has brought in far more in terms of increased Premier League prize money from 2 title challenges, 2 seasons of Champions League money, commercial revenue, and increased player value. Kyle Walker would not have cost £53 million, for example, without 3 seasons of Pochettino coaching behind him. So it's going to affect your player sales, your results, which is the point of why we're all here. So that affects your revenue, Champions League qualification, and all of that. But it just it has this ability to change the club and doesn't have the same end date on it as a player does, because you're not talking about, well, how long can his legs last?
I completely agree with all of that. And, I do feel like always issuing the caveat of like, I'm, at least from my point of view, I'm talking about an inefficiency. I'm not saying that like this will be the cure all for all of your issues at a football club.
Mm-hmm.
Just getting the right manager. We've seen plenty of good managers be at bad football clubs and do a bad job. So it's not like a slam dunk. You get a great manager, but it's like your club's bad, you still have a really good chance
We've also
doing
seen
poorly.
good managers at good teams not do well. There is a level of mix that's necessary, and timing. And I also think the other thing is we're talking about the cream of the crop right now. We're talking about the top 5% of all of this. So we also have to acknowledge Conte comes into Inter and wins the title. He also spent millions of euros in the transfer window to bring in players to help him win the title. We know that Pep Guardiola is probably the best manager in the world. I said probably because you're a Liverpool fan, so someone's going to argue with me at some point. And we also know that he spends the most in the transfer window. So it's not 100% down to him, but he also made 3 straight Champions League semifinals at Bayern, won the league every year, has turned City into a completely different entity, turned around Barcelona, plays a style that everyone wants to watch and everyone wants to play for. So it's not 100% down to the managers, and I don't think either of us think that, and we're not trying to make it sound like that. But if you're spending that level of money on the players, why wouldn't you be focusing and spending that level of money on the management and the way they're being put out there and the way these players are working every single day in games, but also in training?
Yeah, and so just to kind of give examples of what, at least as far as I'm concerned, what I'm talking about and even suggesting is that, let's say you're Valencia. You've seen Julian Lopetegui launch Sevilla into the top 4. Would it be wise to maybe take a punt on him, try to sign him for 12 million? Not that necessarily Sevilla would take it. I mean, you still have to convince Lopetegui, but that might be a worthwhile risk. Ditto, Unai Emery, like he has a track record of making most of the clubs better, especially in Spain. Why, would you not consider signing him for 15 million? And I'm not saying that these are easy things to do. And I think one of the reasons, and I'll, ask you why you think why this doesn't happen more often. But I do think one of the reasons is because when a manager has a good situation at a club, it's really hard for him to walk away from it. And that's what I found really, 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 really interesting about the Haasenhuttel situation at Frankfurt. Because in my head, I'm like, why would you want to leave a place that you're, potentially getting into the Champions League with to go to a team that's not in the Champions League?
And a team.
But let me just finish. But that's also evidence that you can get it done. You can make that happen if you are a Borussia Mönchengladbach. You literally just prized away a great coach from a Champions League team. That shouldn't make sense, but yet they were able to do it. So if I was one of these clubs, I mean, for example, why did Roma not sign Roberto De Zerbi instead of Mourinho? I mean, I hope they tried to do it, and maybe they did put a number up and they couldn't get it done. But I'm saying those are the situations I would be looking to do this. Or Crystal Palace, wave a flag at Espirito Santo, 15 million. I'm just saying, that's the mindset they should have. I'm not saying it'll always happen, but if I were one of these clubs, that's what I would be thinking.
I agree with you. I think some of the things that I would push back with is, although I don't understand the Haasenhuttel one at all, as you don't, is when you're looking at managers, I think one of the things we have to remember is you're just talking about more experienced people who have been in life. So now you're taking out the football side and you're talking to people and saying, well, where do you want to live? Where does your family want to live? What matters to you? And I think that's different than a player who's 19 years old, wants to play on X team because they played with them in FIFA, wants to play alongside so-and-so and is only locked in on that mindset. You're talking about people who have had a different style of life. So it's a different style of recruiting and it's a different conversation. I also think because the structure doesn't exist yet of the selling on, you're now looking at teams and you say, well, why doesn't Valencia go out and get Unai Emery for 15 million euros? Valencia can't guarantee that they can move Unai Emery on. And a lot of what they do with players is, well, we're willing to spend this number because we think they're going to have this value coming out the other side. Yeah. They don't have the money on hand to say, whoa, we want to be good, so we're going to sign this young Argentine, right? It all exists in an ecosystem in which they then sell up to these Champions League clubs or to a team in England, and then they are able to reinvest that money. That doesn't exist yet in this coaching structure, and I think that's why it's interesting that Bayern makes this move, because now that's the trickle down, right? Is, well, then Leipzig can spend this money, Dortmund can spend this money on managers. Then that means smaller clubs can spend money on other managers, right? Because now that money and that transfer market basically becomes alive and is given an opportunity. And I think what we've seen over the last 5-10 years is a lot of unproven, quote unquote, managers getting opportunities, because that's where clubs are taking that risk. Rather than spending money and saying it'll be worth it, they're saying this guy, Graham Potter, needs an opportunity because he does things a little bit differently and no one really knows about him yet. We're going to give him that opportunity. That's the risk, rather than the risk saying, let's go to Spain and take a manager for 4 or 5 million pounds, because that's a risk on its own, right? So it's two different styles of risk taking. I think we've seen one of them start to become really popular over the last 5-10 years. And I would be surprised if this doesn't become more popular over the next few years as the clubs at the top start to enter into this transfer market.
That kind of goes with, we talk about, is this the future? I interviewed Lawrence Stewart, who is the head of recruitment at Monaco, and him and Paul Mitchell work there, and they used to be at Red Bull. And he told me about how they are scouting managers just like they are scouting players. They scout coaches. And I think that's one of these next evolutions is like teams. And, I'm pretty sure 21st Club or 21st Group has been doing this for a while now, Omar. And I think that's really kind of the next wave, is like knowing who are the top managers, should they become available or should you want to get them? And I don't see how at least that will be popular or become more popular. I don't know if this will, paying fees, but I think it will definitely be scouting managers and coaches, just kind of like the Red Bull way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things we're going to start to see head physios, it be competitive to get them in the door, and head of analytics. And
well, that's what they did at Monaco. That's literally what they did. They did that to get, the guys away from Red Bull, right?
Right.
Same thing. They, did it with the analytics guy, Tyler Heaps, and, head of performance. So they did the exact same thing. So I think we'll see that more in the future. I want to finish on a little fun note, Dave, because we've gotten to some serious conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
We mentioned some, great top managers in world football. And I would be curious to ask you, Dave, what do you think these guys would go on the open market? We can go down a list, or we don't even have to do them all. We can talk Jurgen Klopp, Pep, Zidane, Simeone, Conte. We can throw in Bielsa if you want. If there's another manager I haven't mentioned that you want to, put his name in the bag, Christophe Galtier, who we mentioned a couple weeks ago, or, whomever, who are of those names is like, if you wanted to attach a transfer fee to them, how much would Simeone, your boy, go for on the open market? How much is he worth?
So for starters, I would say the clauses I'd put in my deal for Bielsa would have to be like, he'd have to make it past 10 days. If he doesn't make it past 10 days, I'm not transferring any money to you, because he'll just quit whenever he wants to. For Simeone, not kidding, between 40 and 60 million euros. I think he could win anywhere he goes. I know every player wants to play for him. And also the other thing about the way he plays is it's unique. So I think in talking about this, right, as I said, Conte comes in, well, then he's got to go out and buy his players. They're players that other people want, right? Lukaku, Hakimi, all of that. I think because Simeone's style is unique, you can kind of identify players that other people don't want as much and sort of like save money on that side while still being successful, because he's so defensive oriented and the way they play in transition and all of that. So to me, Simeone would be worth somewhere between 45 and 60 million euros. And I don't think that's ridiculous to say, because Look at the players that go for numbers like that and the lack of success they have. And then we just roll on and continue. And I think Pep would be in that conversation as well. And Klopp would be. Give me a year to say Pochettino as well. I would have said it a year and a half ago, coming out of the Champions League final, the way Tottenham played and what he was able to do with that club. I want to see how he does with a PSG group, a group that should win its league, that he can instill his style with the quality that, the overall quality that he never really had at Tottenham. But that he starts to push into that conversation. I was going through the list of the last few Champions League semifinalists since 2013, trying to see, how the managers affected it, where they netted out. One, Massimo Allegri still doesn't have a job, which is fascinating to me. So he's worth 0, and that's probably good value right now. And the other guy that popped out, who's now had more success, who I've always just been a fan of his teams, is Rudy Garcia. And he got Lyon there last year, and he's got them in the title race this year, and didn't go perfectly at Roma for him, but I've always loved the way his teams play. So that would be a guy that you talked about, Unai Emery and Lopetegui, and I think Lopetegui's in that conversation with the way Sevilla has played of like, for a bigger club, quote unquote, that would be the guy I would ID. But Rudy Garcia would be in that conversation as well of like, I'd pay 10 million euros or 15 million euros to bring that guy in and make all my 10 or 15 million euro players worth 25 or 30 on the market to flip over.
I'm going to throw one more name at you, Dave, just because I'm just curious. What would Ralph Haasenhuttel be worth?
Well, based off all of the other Red Bull guys, minimum of 10 million, right?
To me, if I was Crystal Palace, I'd be like, all right, Southampton, let me tempt you with this 10 mil right here, because I think he'd be perfect for them. And with the amount of young players that they're trying to push into the side. Anyway, that was just one that came to my mind, and that's like a classic example of what I think like teams should be at least considering, if not doing, then considering.
So why would Southampton allow that to happen? Right? This is a club that I think they think they're bigger than. Why allow your manager to go?
Well, I mean, it's true. I mean, I'm not looking at it from their point of view. I mean, believe me, I'm not suggesting that they should. We see his value already, so I'm not suggesting they should. I'm saying if I'm Crystal Palace, I mean, listen, Dave, there are a bunch of stupid teams all over. Southampton's not one of them. To be fair, they're not one of them. But like, why would you not if you're Crystal Palace? But yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything you said about the values of the people you mentioned. I mean, I think the highest manager in terms of transfer value would be, since he just signed a contract, Erik ten Hag at Ajax, that we haven't really mentioned. But yeah, I mean, I feel like we've gotten through a good chunk of this. I do want to give a shout out to Mark Thompson, who just wrote a piece about this and who featured heavily in my research, because as we kind of mentioned right before we recorded, like there's actually not a lot of like articles on this or think pieces on this. It's just not really that talked about a lot, which is interesting into itself. But you got any final thoughts, Dave?
No, just back on the Mourinho thing, man. Just super excited to see Mourinho ruin Roma and another club. But no, not really. I would say you mentioned there weren't that many pieces. I think there's like a high level of understanding, right? You have to understand coaching and style and management and money and all these things. And so Mark Thompson, as well as the other people who wrote about this, were really impressive to read. And so I encourage anyone to go out and try and look more into this. And just pay Simeone his money. The guy deserves it. That's all. He needs more black suits. Those black suits are expensive. You got to keep them clean, because any piece of dirt or dust, it shows.
Thanks for joining us as always, Dave. The music for this episode was provided by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about the music in the episode show notes.